Joining me now to discuss, Jelani Cobb, professor of journalism at Columbia University. He is also an MSNBC contributor. Jelani, 20 state attorneys general have now sent a letter to the Biden administration opposing critical race theory in schools. The meaning of the term shifts depending on who is talking about it. So I would love to just start with a definition and why you believe Republicans are taking aim at this now.
I mean, it's funny because I really am curious about how familiar any of these individuals actually are with critical race theory. The kind of working definition of it is that, critical race theory is a legal theory that came out of the 1990s as people were watching the erosion of the hard-won advances in civil rights and anti-discrimination law in the 1950s and 1960s, and it began a critique of where things had gone wrong. And really came to the conclusion that there were elements of white supremacy and racism that were hardwired into structures that had mutated in ways that made it remain viable to discriminate against people, even as we saw the advances or the end of kind of overt things like colored-only signs or mandatory school segregation, et cetera. And so from that vantage point, it's kind of gone outside of law. It was, cultivated by lawyers and inspired by the great legal thinker and civil rights advocate Derek Bell. And so from there are other kinds of applications of it that have fundamentally just looked at how white supremacy has manifested itself and operated inside American institutions.
Well, I want to talk about why that matters. Specifically on the 1619 Project, Nikole Hannah-Jones of the New York Times, the project reframes U.S. history by centering the legacy of Black Americans. And we've learned UNC Chapel Hill won't offer Hannah-Jones tenure after conservative backlash. What do you make of the move, both sort of as an academic, but also what it says about this moment in American history?
Sure. I mean, there's always been a difficulty in this country, particularly for forces that reactionary forces, to contemplate or to countenance the actual nature of the past, the nature of American history. And so the idea of talking about founding principles, and they say in Texas they want to talk about the founding principles. Well, sure, let's talk about those founding principles, because slavery was hardwired into the U.S. Constitution. The same document that protected the sovereignty and freedom of white people protected the transatlantic slave trade for 20 years and created the Three-Fifths Compromise and ensured that people who escaped slavery would have to be returned to slavery. That's in the U.S. Constitution. So we can't escape this by simply saying we want to talk about founding principles. The founding principles are the reason we're having that conversation in the first place. So what they really mean is that they want to have a conversation about propaganda. And they want to use history as a resume, in which we only talk about the glorious, complimentary, wonderful things that have happened, as if the path from 1776 to 2021 has been nothing but an unbroken chain of wonderful. And so, this is what we're talking about. We're actually trying to talk about is the actual history so that we might better immunize ourselves against the failures that have confronted this society again and again and again.
Right. And what is sort of wild is that what we are watching happen is actually enunciating those system failures. Adam Sewer in The Atlantic, he writes, quote, "The prevailing conservative view is that America's racial and economic inequalities are driven by differences in effort and ability. The work of Hannah-Jones and others suggests instead that present-day inequalities have been shaped by deliberate political and policy choices. What appears to be an argument about re-examining history is also an argument about ideology, a defense of the legitimacy of the existing social order against an account of its historical origins that suggests different policy choices could produce a more equitable society." I apologize because that is, in other words, sort of the same thing you expressed, but I think it is worth coming back to because it has so much bearing, not just on the U.S. education system, but policy and governing as we watch it happen on Capitol Hill.
Sure. I mean, I think Adam is exactly right on that. And so when people are looking at history in this way, and I mean, and we know this as historians, that the version of history that you find in the present very often reflects the concerns people have at the moment the history is being written. And so the history is not only about the past, it's about the present. And that's almost always the case. And so in creating this kind of pristine and morally upright version of the past, they rationalize and justify the present day inequalities. That's not anything new. As a matter of fact, there's an entire history of that kind of thinking. But if we're going to go back, the earliest versions of pointing out these contradictions have been met with the same sorts of resistance, often violent resistance. And so we see nothing new here. It's just tiresome and frustrating that we have not made more difference. We've not evolved to a higher state of maturity as a society.